What happens when federal law enforcement operations spark nationwide protests? What happens when local communities push back against federal policies they believe violate their rights? And what happens when elected officials start questioning whether the system of checks and balances is actually working the way the Constitution intended? Today, we're breaking down a series of events that show how American democracy actually functions under pressure. We're talking about federal agents, local resistance, constitutional oversight, and the entire system of government accountability that most people learned about in school, but rarely see in action. This isn't about taking sides. This is about understanding how the system works, or sometimes doesn't work, when power, policy, and public pressure collide. Let's get into it. To understand what's happening right now, you need to understand a few things about how federal law enforcement actually works in the United States. First, federal agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also called ICE, operate under the Department of Homeland Security. They enforce federal immigration laws across the country. Second, the United States has something called federalism. That means power is divided between the federal government and state governments, and sometimes those two levels of government disagree on how laws should be enforced. Third, the Constitution guarantees certain rights to all people in the United States, including the First Amendment right to protest, the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches, and the Fifth Amendment right to due process. When federal enforcement operations escalate in ways that local communities believe violate these constitutional protections, you get protests, you get lawsuits, you get elected officials stepping in, and sometimes you get federal policy changes. That's what we're seeing play out right now in multiple cities across the country, and it's a textbook example of how checks and balances are supposed to work in a democratic system. So how exactly did local communities push back against federal operations they believed were unconstitutional? Let me walk you through the tools they used, because this is civics in action. Tool number 1, peaceful protest. The First Amendment guarantees the right to peaceful assembly and protest. Thousands of people exercise that right by showing up at federal facilities, hotels housing agents, and public spaces. They made their voices heard. They documented incidents on camera. They created public pressure. Tool number 2, economic leverage. Private businesses have the legal right to refuse service in most cases, as long as it's not based on protected characteristics like race or religion. Hotels chose not to house federal agents. Restaurants refused to serve them. This wasn't illegal. It was a business decision based on community values. Some people might call this controversial, but it's also how capitalism and freedom of association work in a democratic society. Tool number 3, local government authority. This is where federalism comes into play. Local officials have certain powers that the federal government cannot override. For example, a city official in one case revoked a building permit for a federal detention facility. That's within their legal authority. State and local governments control zoning, licensing, and permits. When they use those powers to resist federal policies they believe are unjust, that's federalism at work. Tool number 4, public documentation and transparency. Constitutional observer networks trained thousands of people to document federal operations. They recorded interactions. They filed reports. They created a public record that could be used in lawsuits, legislative hearings, and investigations. Transparency is a check on government power. When government agents know they're being watched and documented, they're more likely to follow the rules. While protests were happening in the streets, another form of resistance was happening in Washington, D.C., Congressional oversight. Here's how it works. Even when one political party controls the presidency and has significant power, the minority party in Congress still has certain tools. They can hold hearings, they can subpoena witnesses, they can demand testimony under oath, they can investigate whether federal agencies are violating the law. And that's exactly what happened. Members of Congress held public hearings about the incidents in Minneapolis and other cities. They brought in witnesses, including people who were present during confrontations with federal agents. They asked questions about use of force policies, legal authority, and constitutional compliance. Now, you might be thinking, if the minority party doesn't control Congress, how much power do they really have? Good question. The answer is limited, but not zero. Public hearings create a record. They put testimony on the official record. They force government officials to answer questions under oath. And they create political pressure that can influence policy changes. But here's where it gets more serious. Some members of Congress started talking about more extreme measures, things like invoking the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. Let me explain what that is, because it's important. The 25th Amendment allows for the removal of a president if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet believe the president is unable to discharge the duties of the office. It was created after President Kennedy's assassination as a way to handle presidential incapacity. It has never been successfully used to remove a sitting president, ever. So when senators start publicly discussing the 25th Amendment, that's not normal political rhetoric. That's a signal that some lawmakers believe the situation has reached a crisis level. In this case, some senators expressed concern that certain presidential decisions were being driven by personal motivations rather than national interest. They pointed to statements about territorial acquisition, fixation on international recognition, and decisions that appeared to escalate tensions without clear strategic benefit. Whether you agree with those concerns or not, the fact that members of Congress are even raising them tells you something about how unstable the political environment has become. Now, there's another dimension to this story that ties into broader concerns about federal power and constitutional limits. Recently, federal law enforcement executed a court-authorized warrant to seize election-related records in Georgia. This was connected to ongoing investigations into claims about the 2020 election. Here's why this matters. In the United States, elections are run by states, not by the federal government. That's by design. The founders specifically did not want one centralized authority controlling how elections are conducted, because that would create too much potential for abuse. Each state has its own election laws, its own election officials, and its own certification process. The federal government can investigate federal crimes related to elections, but it cannot take over state election systems. So when federal agents execute warrants related to state election records, even with court authorization, election law experts start raising red flags. Why? Because it sets a precedent. If one administration can use federal law enforcement to investigate state election processes based on claims that have already been rejected by courts, what's to stop future administrations from doing the same thing? Some officials have gone even further, making statements suggesting that federal authorities should have more control over state elections. That's a direct challenge to the constitutional principle of federalism. And here's where it connects back to everything we've been talking about. When federal power expands in ways that challenge constitutional boundaries, whether it's immigration enforcement that communities believe violates civil rights, or federal involvement in state elections that legal experts say undermine democratic norms, the system is supposed to push back. That pushback can come from protests, it can come from local governments, it can come from Congress, it can come from courts. Ideally, it comes from all of those things working together. That's what checks and balances means. No single branch or level of government should have unchecked power. Let's talk about something that doesn't get covered enough in these stories: the economic cost of political conflict. In Minneapolis, businesses have reported massive revenue declines during the period of heightened federal enforcement operations and protests. The city estimates the economic impact at roughly $20 million per week. That's not a small number. That's people's livelihoods. That's paychecks. That's families struggling to pay rent. Part of that decline comes from fear. When communities feel unsafe, people stay home. They don't go to restaurants. They don't shop. Kids stay home from school. Parents can't go to work. But part of it comes from deliberate choices. Small business owners have voluntarily closed their doors in solidarity with protesters. They're taking a financial hit because they believe the cause is more important than short-term profit. One business owner we heard from runs a salon in Minneapolis. She talked about how scary it is from a business perspective to participate in these solidarity strikes, but also how important it feels. She said something that really stuck with me. She said, "For me to expect people to come in and just purchase stuff when they're hiding in their houses scared to go out, I don't even know what the point of it is right now." That's a powerful statement. It shows that for some people, there are principles that matter more than profit. But here's the contrast. Large corporations, including major retailers based in Minnesota, have largely stayed silent. Some signed generic letters calling for de-escalation, but they haven't taken concrete stands the way small businesses have. Why does that matter? Because those large corporations have much bigger financial cushions. They could afford to take a stand, but they haven't. That tells you something about who bears the cost of political conflict in America. It's usually working people and small business owners, not wealthy corporations. Here's what I want you to take away from this video. 1. Civic engagement matters. Protests, votes, documentation, transparency. These are all tools that ordinary people can use to hold power accountable. 2. Checks and balances are real, but they only work if people use them. That means local governments exercising their authority. That means Congress doing oversight. That means courts enforcing constitutional limits. 3. Federalism is a feature, not a bug. The division of power between federal and state governments is designed to prevent any one entity from having too much control. 4. Economic power matters. When communities coordinate to use their economic leverage, it creates pressure that political leaders have to respond to. And 5. Democracy is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, and constant participation. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like button, share it with someone who wants to understand how the system actually works, and subscribe because we're going to keep breaking down these complex political situations in ways that make sense. Drop a comment below. What part of this story do you think is most important? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching.